Before we begin, drop in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe that true heroes wear their scars in silence, hit like and subscribe because this story proves that sometimes, the quietest person in the room has the loudest story to tell. It happened on a Saturday beneath crystal chandeliers and elegant drapes that transformed an ordinary venue into something that pretended to be extraordinary. The kind of wedding where everything gleamed a little too brightly, where laughter seemed rehearsed, and where Eleanor Hartley, 67, mother of the groom, sat alone at table 17 near the buffet station, half-shadowed and completely overlooked. Her navy blue dress suit was impeccably pressed but visibly older than most guests' attire, and the small faded ribbon pinned discreetly beneath her lapel drew more skeptical glances than respectful nods. She sat with perfect posture, back straight, hands folded neatly on the table, a discipline ingrained through decades of service that most people mistook for the stiffness of age. The wedding of her son Michael Hartley, tech executive with a polished smile and carefully curated image, was proceeding exactly as planned, meticulously orchestrated, photographed from every flattering angle, and completely devoid of anything authentic that might disrupt the perfect narrative he had constructed for himself and his new bride. Eleanor hadn't been called to say a few words. Her name wasn't mentioned during the ceremony. She wasn't included in the family photos positioned prominently near the guest book. The slideshow of Michael's life journey conveniently began with college graduation, skipping the 18 years she had raised him alone. She sipped water from a crystal glass, watching guests' network and posture, occasionally catching fragments of conversation. "That's his mother. I thought she was staff. And, Michael never mentions her, must be complicated." She didn't flinch at these whispers. Instead, she smiled faintly, like someone who had weathered far worse storms and survived missions where the stakes were infinitely higher than social approval. The reception was in full swing when the best man, Michael's brother-in-law, tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted as he raised his champagne flute with practiced charm. "To Mike," he announced, voice carrying across the hall, "first in the family to really serve his country, if you count those defense contracts." Laughter rippled through the crowd like a contagion, while Eleanor simply adjusted her napkin, her expression unchanged. She never interrupted, never defended, just sat quietly with her glass of water and a plate of untouched cake. Even when Michael's new uncle-in-law, a lobbyist with an expensive watch and cheap manners, staggered over to her table. "So, Mrs. Hartley," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Mike says you claim to have been some kind of special agent or something." His tone dripped with condescension. "Ever actually see any action, or just push papers around?" Eleanor looked at him with calm eyes that had once assessed threats in war zones and simply replied, "Some operations don't make the history books." This was met with barely concealed snickers from surrounding tables. A woman in designer heels leaned toward her companion and whispered, not quietly enough, "My hairdresser's mother says the same thing." Turns out she was a secretary who filed travel requisitions. Another guest added, "If she was such a big deal, wouldn't the military have acknowledged it by now? I mean, look at her." The comments continued as Eleanor sat with a grace none of them deserved and a patience none had earned. When the father-son dance was announced, she watched as Michael took the floor with his stepfather, a man who'd entered his life at 16. The DJ had skipped the mother-son dance entirely. A young couple at the next table didn't bother lowering their voices. Why would a real intelligence officer be taking the bus to her son's wedding? Right? And if she really did all those classified missions, wouldn't there be some recognition? A pension? Something better than that sad little ribbon? Eleanor just sipped her water, smiled, and murmured to no one in particular, "Sometimes the most important missions end with silence, not applause." What the wedding guests didn't know, what they didn't bother to ask, was that Eleanor Hartley had spent over 20 years deployed in locations that didn't officially exist, assigned to intelligence units that had no public records, conducting operations that remained classified decades after completion. The small ribbon pinned to her jacket, the only one she was permitted to wear in public, had been quietly reissued to her 3 months earlier under a new citation code after a policy shift declassified portions of Operation Clay Ash. This operation had been so deeply buried that even congressional oversight committees had received only heavily redacted briefings. The mission had involved the extraction of 17 hostages from a situation deemed diplomatically impossible by 3 separate administrations. Eleanor had declined the official medal ceremony in Washington because, as she had written in her response to the intelligence director, "I'd rather honor my promises than collect applause." Her career had been defined by her ability to blend in, to be overlooked, to appear ordinary. These same qualities that had made her exceptional in the field now made her invisible at her own son's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it didn't surprise her either. Years earlier, when Michael was 15, Eleanor had tried to share small fragments of her work with him, nothing classified, just enough for him to understand why she'd missed his baseball championships or arrived late to parent-teacher conferences. But Michael, already embarrassed by his mother's modest lifestyle compared to his friends' parents, had dismissed her explanations as excuses, her hints at classified work as fabrications. By the time he'd graduated college and built his career in tech, Eleanor had become an inconvenient footnote in the biography he presented to the world. The mysterious mother who claimed to work for the government but couldn't prove it became easier to minimize, then ignore, and finally reinvent as a simple administrative worker who'd exaggerated her importance. As the evening progressed, Eleanor watched her son navigate the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, occasionally glancing in her direction with a mixture of obligation and discomfort before quickly looking away. Each averted gaze was a familiar wound, the same look he'd given her at his college graduation when she'd arrived straight from an overseas assignment, exhausted but determined not to miss another milestone. The wedding cake was being served when Eleanor decided it was time to leave. She had come because she loved her son, not because she needed recognition. She buttoned her jacket, reached into her purse for a small square envelope addressed to Michael in her careful handwriting, and began making her way toward the exit. No one noticed her leaving. No one except a retired army sergeant seated at her table who gave her a curious look as she passed. "Heading out already, ma'am?" he asked. "I've stayed long enough," Eleanor replied with a small smile. Some audiences aren't ready for certain truths. The sergeant studied her ribbon for a moment, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "That's not a standard commendation," he said quietly. Eleanor simply nodded once. "Enjoy the rest of the evening." She continued toward the exit, envelope in hand, her steps measured and purposeful despite the ache in her left knee, a souvenir from a helicopter extraction gone wrong in '89, an incident that officially never happened. Behind her, Michael was posing with the wedding cake beside an ice sculpture that cost more than Eleanor's modest sedan. He was surrounded by his new wife's family, all of them laughing at some joke that didn't include the woman who had once carried him through a fever that lasted 3 days, who had taught him to read by flashlight during power outages, who had silently protected him from threats he would never know existed. Eleanor paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of all the unspoken truths between them. Then, straightening her shoulders, the same way she had before every mission, she turned to step into the night, leaving behind the noise and the glitter, walking softly down the gravel path alone. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a sound that Eleanor recognized instantly, the distinctive rhythmic thump of rotor blades cutting through air. She froze mid-step, her body responding to the sound before her mind could process why a helicopter would be approaching a wedding venue. Inside, the steady thrumming grew loud enough to penetrate the reception's ambient noise. Conversations halted as guests turned toward the windows, confusion rippling across the room. The unmistakable sound of a military-grade helicopter descending drew everyone's attention skyward. Through the venue's glass walls, they watched as a matte black helicopter, unmarked but unmistakably government issue, touched down on the manicured lawn beyond the reception tent. Its rotors continued spinning, kicking up wind that bent the decorative trees and sent napkins flying from unattended tables. 4 figures emerged, 3 men and 1 woman, all in formal dress uniforms with insignia that few in the room could identify. They moved with military precision toward the reception entrance, led by a woman whose bearing commanded immediate attention, an intelligence operations commander with a chest full of decorations that gleamed under the venue lights. Eleanor had turned back, standing now at the threshold between leaving and staying, her envelope still clutched in one hand as the commander spotted her and moved directly in her direction. "Mrs. Hartley," the commander's voice carried across the now silent room, "you are not dismissed." Whispers erupted as the uniformed team entered, carrying between them a sealed shadow box. They placed it carefully on the head table where Eleanor should have been seated all night. The commander pulled a faded photograph from a folder, Eleanor in winter gear, flanked by a covert team in front of a helicopter, Operation Clay Ash, faintly visible on the aircraft's side. Michael stood frozen beside his bride, champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips, as the commander addressed the room without need for a microphone. "This woman's silence has been mistaken for fiction for too long." A recording played from a device one of the officers held. An official voice declaring, "Declassified mission details. Operation Clay Ash. Hostage extraction under extreme diplomatic constraints. Success rate, 100%. Casualties, 0. Decorations withheld under National Security Directive 17B until present date." The crowd's disbelief deepened as the commander turned to Michael. "Your mother led a mission that saved 17 American lives under circumstances so dangerous that 3 separate tactical teams had deemed it impossible. You never asked, and she never needed to tell." Eleanor's past, once dismissed as fantasy, now stood undeniable before everyone as the commander opened the shadow box to reveal a rare intelligence service medal and citations signed by 3 consecutive presidents. "This is the highest civilian intelligence honor our nation bestows," the commander explained. "Only 7 have ever been awarded. Your mother holds 2. Around the room, expressions transformed from skepticism to shock. The lobbyist who had mocked Eleanor earlier sank into his chair. The woman who had whispered about the hairdresser's mother covered her mouth with her hand. Most striking was Michael's face, pale, stunned, eyes darting between his mother and the evidence of a life he had never bothered to understand. "We brought this ceremony here," the commander concluded, "because your son deserves to know the woman who raised him." The DJ's music had stopped completely. The room filled only with the weight of truth and the soft sound of the helicopter's idling rotors outside. As Eleanor stood quietly at the threshold, the wind whispered through the tent, carrying a long overdue reckoning. Eleanor didn't rush to the microphone. In fact, she didn't move at all at first, just stood there under the reception lights with her hands clasped before her and her shoulders squared, not to impress, but because that posture had been trained into her as permanently as the silence she had maintained for decades. The wedding crowd remained frozen, half in awe, half in shame, waiting to see if the woman they'd all ignored would speak. And after a long breath, she did, but not from the stage, not with a microphone, just from where she stood, in a voice steady and soft enough that somehow everyone leaned forward to hear it. "I didn't come here to make a scene," she said. "I came here because I love my son. That's all. I never needed recognition." Her eyes met Michael's across the room. He stood motionless beside his bride, looking like a man who had just been introduced to his own mother for the first time. "I've spent most of my life watching people celebrate the loudest person in the room," Eleanor continued, "and thinking the quiet ones didn't matter. I kept quiet not because I had nothing to say, but because what I did wasn't supposed to be talked about." You could hear a pin drop in the reception hall. My missions weren't on the news. They didn't come with press conferences. But they kept people alive who never knew my name. A ripple of discomfort moved through the guests like the air itself was adjusting to make room for this new reality. Michael took a step forward, then another, his voice breaking when he finally spoke. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Really tell me?" Eleanor looked at him, not with judgment but with something heavier, tired affection, the weight of years of misunderstanding. "Because you were never supposed to carry it," she said simply. "You were my future, not my past." The commander stepped forward now and added, "Your mother led Operation Clay Ash, one of the most high-risk extractions ever executed. 17 hostages, 0 casualties. No one talks about it because she followed orders and buried her legacy in silence. Until tonight." Someone near the cake table let out a stunned breath. The lobbyist who had mocked Eleanor earlier slumped in his chair, eyes downcast. Eleanor stepped toward the head table, touched the shadow box once, then turned back to the guests. I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to be here. I wanted to watch my son get married, maybe dance a little, and be proud. That's all. Michael, eyes glistening now, walked forward and embraced her, really embraced her, and whispered something no one else heard. Something that made Eleanor's hands tremble slightly before finally wrapping around her son's back, like the closing of a circle that had taken decades to complete. When they pulled apart, Eleanor smiled gently and said, "Play my favorite song, if you have it," and the DJ, still visibly shaken, found the track, Unforgettable, by Nat King Cole. Eleanor turned not to her son but to his bride, extending her hand with the grace of someone who had navigated far more treacherous situations than a wedding reception. The young woman hesitated only briefly before accepting, and together they moved to the center of the dance floor. They danced slowly, elegantly, while the guests stepped back to create space, watching a woman they'd misjudged move with the quiet confidence of someone who had always belonged at the center but chose the shadows instead. No one filmed it. No one dared speak. The only sounds were the music and, from some corners of the room, quiet sniffles as the reality of their collective misjudgment settled in. When the music faded, the only sound was the gentle clink of a glass as one guest, the retired army sergeant who had noticed Eleanor's ribbon earlier, stood and offered a silent salute. Others followed, military and civilian alike. Not a word, just respect long overdue. Eleanor turned to Michael one last time, handed him the sealed envelope she had tried to leave with hours earlier, and said simply, "Open it when you need to remember who you are." Then she walked out, not as a forgotten mother, but as a woman finally seen. The helicopter lifted slowly behind her, a silent escort in a night sky that no longer ignored her presence. By morning, no one remembered the flavor of the cake or the bride's entrance or the string quartet that had cost thousands. They remembered a photograph taken quietly near the dessert table, Eleanor Hartley standing tall beside her son, shadow box under one arm, with a caption that would later be shared thousands of times online. Turns out the quietest woman in the room saved more lives than anyone present. We just never asked. And in Michael's office weeks later, above the framed photograph and shadow box, hung a single quote from his mother's field journal, edged in brass: "The loudest voice isn't always the most important. Listen for the whispers, they're usually trying to save you." The envelope had contained only 2 items, her original, classified service record, finally declassified, and a simple note that read, "I was always there, even when you couldn't see me." 6 months after the wedding, Michael started a foundation supporting female veterans transitioning to civilian life. When interviewed about his inspiration, he simply said, "I learned that heroes don't always wear their medals where you can see them. Sometimes they're sitting quietly at table 17, waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Eleanor began speaking at small, select events about intelligence history, never her specific missions, but enough to help a new generation understand that service comes in many forms, and that women have always been on the front lines, even when history books left them out. The wedding video never made it online, but the story did, shared first by the army sergeant who witnessed it all, then by others present that night. It spread not because it was sensational, but because it reminded people of an essential truth: respect isn't earned through volume but through character. If you know a veteran whose story hasn't been heard, especially the women who served in silence, take a moment to comment "respect" below. Their sacrifices deserve our recognition, even if they never asked for it. And remember, the next time you see someone sitting quietly in the corner, they might just have the most extraordinary story in the room. They're just waiting for someone to care enough to listen.